Welcome everyone, this is Tim Pullman and you're listening to the SEP Couch. This podcast is all about standard essential patents. We talk about patent strategies, FRAND licensing, patent pooling, and patent litigation. So let's dive into today's episode. He has been with Siemens, BenQ, Nokia, and in the past years, the licensing or chief licensing officer for patents at Audi. I'm very, very happy to have here today Matthias Schneider. Welcome.
Thank you for inviting me. It will be very interesting, I hope.
I am very sure, Matthias, it will be. And I'm starting with my first question. I introduced that a little bit already, but it would be great if you could let us know some of the most important steps in your career and how you got in touch with SEPs. You and me, I think we know each other since over 10 years, but you've been involved much longer, I'm sure. So the floor is yours, and again, welcome.
Yes, that's true. I've been working in the IP area and almost from the beginning with standard essential patents from roughly 2002. Just as a little bit of background, I'm not a patent attorney. I'm not an attorney. I'm an engineer, computer scientist by education, and I've been working in research and development at Siemens for almost 20 years before I started working in the IP field. When I did that at Siemens, I immediately got into the setup of the 2G and 3G patent licensing program of Siemens. And again, at that time in the cellular communication market, companies would always only market or license their standard essential patents. So from the very beginning, before I even understood what patent law is, I already was in active in out licensing of SEPs. And from then on, it continued. When Siemens sold their mobile phone business to BenQ, I joined BenQ, and suddenly from being a person working mostly in out licensing, I became a licensee representative, and I had to negotiate license agreements from the other side of the table. At Nokia, I was not that much involved with standard essential patents because those were separate programs where I was not involved. I was dealing with in-licensing, so basically dealing with assertions that we received. And then finally, I was hired by Audi to address exactly that topic. How can the automotive industry deal with the assertions of standard essential patent holders?
That is exactly what I would love to start touching on, Matthias, because I think it's not so often, at least yet, that people have been on both sides of the table. In particular, looking at what we have seen in the past years, that standard essential patent litigation has especially increased a lot in the automotive space. So many people keep talking about, they call it a clash of cultures. You did both. You've been with the telecom people. You've been now for past 6 years with the automotive people. Is that true? Is it so different? Is licensing perceived so different in these different industries?
Yes, it is perceived quite differently, and the different industries behave differently when it comes to patenting, to patent prosecution, and to patent licensing, asserting their portfolios. That's very clear. I've always said when I started working for Audi, the automotive industry is a haven of peace in the heavy waters of licensing, because companies are not really usually not aggressively licensing their portfolios in the industry. So most companies, most OEMs in particular, are not really up to asserting their portfolio against their competitors to get a market advantage or whatever. That is just not happening. And that is very different from the ICT industry, where patent assertions and patent litigation are part of the day-to-day business, so to speak.
Any idea why that is the case? Is it also because of that the OEMs have strong positions in the value chain? Is it gentlemen agreements among the larger OEMs? Why is that so?
Yeah, I think there's a few aspects there that you need to look at. Aspect number one is that the automotive industry has this licensing behavior where the suppliers take licenses and they cross-license amongst themselves. So if you have a tier one manufacturer for brakes, for example, then that tier one manufacturer will provide all the necessary licenses that deal with brake patents. So with the patents that cover the products that they are selling to you. That has the biggest advantage that the component manufacturers don't have to compete with saying we have all relevant licenses and our products are more expensive, but we have all the licenses, because all the tier one manufacturers or tier one suppliers are expected to deliver their products with licenses. The opposite, or the side effect of that is that as an OEM, you don't need a huge licensing or patenting department, because you do not deal with patents that deal with brakes or motors or tires or wheels or whatever you take as components. You don't have to do that. So if you look at the size of patent and IP departments in the ICT industry, these departments are huge compared to what we see in the automotive industry.
And has that changed? Because my understanding now is that the automotive space is into heavy waters compared to maybe years before.
I mean, first of all, I don't think it's that bad. I mean, yes, things have changed a little, but it is still not something where I would be too worried that it cannot be handled anymore. No, it hasn't changed. I've rather seen patent department become smaller, and the only area where this licensing behavior is changing is really in the SEP space with ICT, standard essential patents, and even there. During the 5 years that I have watched this, I would say the ICT patent owners have changed their behavior more than the automotive industry. And you also have to see, when I joined Audi in 2016, nobody was really knowledgeable about SEPs in our company and in other automotive companies as well. That has changed. The same has changed at the supplier level, and all the fights that are currently going on with what you call the heavy waters probably will kind of calm down when we go to the next generation of technologies, when people negotiated supply contracts without knowing what they have to basically put into escrow for potential SEP risks. That was in 2014, 15, 16. Now they know. So if they now create or if they now negotiate a supply or purchasing contract, you can't get an indemnification from a supplier without heavily paying for it. The problem that created those heavy waters very often was that the suppliers signed contracts without knowing what the risk was, and suddenly they faced the risk for which they didn't have accruals or reserves, and then life becomes difficult for both sides.
And I think that is a very interesting aspect. And I don't know if you're able to share more here, but what I'm really excited about to understand is that we've seen that the SEP licenses and SEP owners, they approach OEMs, while the suppliers, as you said, have signed indemnification clauses supplying their, for example, connectivity boxes, basically saying they take care of the IP, but now the OEM has to pay. How is that working in the value chain? How are the costs shared? What is the typical practice? How do OEMs internally deal with that with their suppliers?
Yeah. I mean, let's first look at this from a philosophical level. The issue really is none of us is willing to pay licenses to the patent owners. So the OEM will not basically take licenses that have to be paid to license owners from their profit. Neither the suppliers will do that, not the manufacturer, if we talk about 4G and 5G, nor the head unit manufacturer is willing to basically reduce its profit. So in the end, who will have to pay for licenses? Our customer. So in the end, whatever the license fees are overall for the entire value chain must end up on the price of a car that is sold to a customer. I mean, because you know, I have an obligation towards my shareholders to optimize my profit, and so has the employee of a supplier, which basically means everyone tries to maximize their profits, and the license fees will, in the end, have to be paid by the buyer of a vehicle, of a car. Now, what really happens is that these supply negotiations in the automotive industry are really tough. I mean, this is probably one of the hardest negotiated areas that I've ever seen. And especially the big OEMs have a lot of power in that. And they are trying to put the pressure on their suppliers in situations where they didn't know that they had to pay for the licenses, and the suppliers didn't know that they had to pay for licenses. They signed agreements, and now they're saying, hey, you guys, you signed an indemnification, and now do it. But the suppliers can't even do that because they can't get licenses. And that is one of the areas where we've seen not litigation, not too much litigation actually, but a lot of fights going on.
That is interesting. And when we think about pricing a bit, there are offerings in the market. We all know the Avanci pool, who actually managed to attract, you know, many of the largest SEP owners, even including patent assertion entities, some call them patent trolls, to be members and offer one contract, a one-stop license. And that for multimode is at $15 US per car. Why do we still see, you know, licensees, automotive companies not join Avanci? What are the reasons? Is it all about these $15? Is it internal negotiations in the value chain? What is the major issue for these OEMs?
Yeah. You know, if I want to be sarcastic in that area, I would say it's because many of these companies have not understood that if they integrate technology into their products without developing that technology for themselves, the license fee is more or less a payment for R&D that they didn't do. I mean, if you want, again, let's become a little bit philosophically and basic. The automotive industry could have developed their own cellular communication standard that would have cost billions of dollars. And they would not have succeeded. That's the other issue. Technology, from a technology side, that is probably impossible. But they have decided, or they were forced to by the regulator, to use a technology that someone else has developed. So the automotive industry has saved all the development money by not developing the technology, but basically buying the technology of someone else. And for that, you have to pay license fees. Who will be the payer of that license fee? That is another question. It can be the supplier who implements the NAD or builds the head unit. It can be the OEM itself. That doesn't matter. But the entire value chain has to be prepared to pay licenses. Now, is $15 too much? So that's one aspect. You know, if you do not understand that philosophical concept that if you do not do your own R&D, then you somehow have to pay for the R&D of others, then you will not be really willing to pay license fees. Then the second question is $15 too much, too little? Frankly speaking, I don't know. And I don't think that anyone can answer that question. The $15 are the results of negotiations between the Avanci administrator and various OEMs. And in the end, the $15 were accepted by a few OEMs, and then they got published. Could have been 18, could have been 12, I don't know. What I can say is I have no argument that I could show to a judge to explain that the $15 are not FRAND, which means absent any argument why the 15 shouldn't work, as an implementer, I simply have to say, okay, that's it.
I think one aspect is the number, right? And we can go back and forth how that number came up. At least we see a lot of OEMs nowadays accepted that $15. So in a way, at least partly market accepted, to put it that way. However, it's not only about the $15 per se, it's also about the structure. It's a lump sum. And a very expensive high-end car, which can cost up to 150,000 euros, pays $15, same as the small, medium-sized car, maybe only, with a selling price of 20K. So, and that is at least what we see, that the high-end brands, OEMs, join Avanci as licensees, while the others shy away. And in the extreme case of the Volkswagen Group, it's exactly those high-end brands that join and the low-end brands didn't join. So within the group even, there is differences. Is that maybe somehow a sign that the $15 work only for the high-end cars?
No, I really don't think so. I mean, the issue really is, and there are a few German court cases and publications by judges that make that clear. The FRAND rate for a patent portfolio must be related to the value that the technology, the standardized and patented technology, brings to the end product. So you have to look at the question, how much is the value that the technology, cellular communication in our example, brings to a car? And is there a big difference between, let's say, what the technology brings to an A3 or A1 Audi or a Golf or a Passat Volkswagen? And if you ask me, I would say the difference is negligible. I mean, they have the same technology, they have the same possibilities to do over-the-air updates, at least for their ICT technology. They've got navigation systems that can be updated. They have traffic information systems that work very similarly. So there's no reason why a Volkswagen Polo, Golf, or Passat should pay a different value, absolute value, and that's important, absolute value, as compared to an Audi. That might change when you go to autonomous cars, which make more use of the technology for autonomous driving. There, you can argue that there should be a difference, but in the 4G area, that's where we talk when we discuss the $15. I personally can't see a big difference, and there is simply no reason why the $15 should not be applicable to a Polo or a Ford car, for example.
And I think apart from discussing what a reasonable SEP royalty rate is, that would be FRAND. I think the second most discussed issue was with regard to the auto industry, where in the value chain should SEP licenses be available? As I said, right now, it's the OEM level that SEP holders offer that Avanci offers that. But if what you say is the concept we should look at, where does the patented technology create value? And that is in the end product. Is it even possible to license on the component level? Because how can you know where that component is implemented?
Well, that's first of all, I think the component manufacturers, I mean, I don't want to talk about chipsets now, but let's say everything that is has the technology and the complexity of a network access device or more a higher component. They know very well where their components are sold to. And I cannot see a reason why a license agreement where you pay different absolute royalty values in euros or US dollars for components that go into different applications areas would be considered not FRAND. So not non-discriminatory. I mean, it's extremely difficult to kind of interpret the non-discrimination requirement of FRAND when you compare a Porsche with a refrigerator, for example, which means it can well be that the refrigerator doesn't have to pay, the refrigerator manufacturer doesn't have to pay the same amount of money in US dollars that Porsche would have to pay for their 911. However, as I said, there's no reason why that should not be FRAND. So at least from that level, from the NAD manufacturer level, they know where the products go, and it should be possible to do it that way. In some ways, I believe I do not really understand the argument of the patent owners. They should not really care as long as they get the money that that is agreed. And in the worst case, if I'm a patent owner, why am I not giving a component manufacturer an agreement where they have to pay the highest possible rate and tell them, if you want to pay less, come back and we can renegotiate. That would be a very simple solution. On the other hand, this argument calculating FRAND royalties based on an ASP of the component, the average sales price of a component, and a percentage which doesn't change wherever you license, is a very simple way of reducing the license cost by moving up the value chain. And that is exactly what those German judges have said. That cannot happen. You cannot punish the patent owner if it decides to license higher up in the value chain. At least in US dollars and cents, the value has to be the same wherever a patent owner decides to license.
So just to summarize what you said, if I understood it right, let's say if someone guarantees the $15 for that particular examples remain the $15, no matter where in the value chain, then also a component level licensing could work, but somehow that has to be guaranteed and not only been a strategy to reduce the license cost.
Yeah. From a practical point of view, if you really try to administer large licensing contracts, there are other arguments that are important for the decision where in the value chain you want to license. That has to do with this question of accountability. On the chipset level, where millions of chips are created and again, let's be a little bit sarcastic, put into a cubic meter wooden box and shipped from Asia to somewhere without being numbered, it's very difficult to find out which of those chips are licensed and which are not. So giving a license to a chipset manufacturer is, for the patent owner, very difficult to digest. As soon as the product can be identified in the cellular area, for example, by having an IMEI, a International Mobile Equipment Identifier number. From that point on, you can license on that level because it's accountable. You know if the manufacturer of that component has paid the license because it can be attached to the IMEI. So that's one. Auditing issues are a topic that people have to look at. And last not least, it's also a question on where is the manufacturer located globally. If you have a Chinese manufacturer who doesn't care about paying licenses, and you try to litigate against that manufacturer, that can be a tough game. Let's put it that way.
I can see. That makes a lot of sense. Maybe also with regards to, again, that question, where in the value chain? So there's right now no offering. The reasons are understood. The SEP owners fear that, you know, going up the value chain reduces licenses. There's also even, you know, some of the suppliers have gone to court and asked competition authorities to clarify that they want to have access. Why so far that hasn't worked, or what is your opinion there? Should SEP holders be mandatory to license at a FRAND rate, of course, or is that still something the market has to self-regulate?
I mean, I think the market can regulate that. That's what I said when I mentioned earlier that patent owners have changed more than the licensees on the automotive side. I mean, I can't go into too much detail here, but when I see what's currently happening in the 5G area, so the first license offerings for 5G components, the willingness to at least go up one level to the tier one supplier and license the tier one supplier is visible with many companies. It has been, I mean, many patent owners have done that before. There's a very small group of companies that have never done that, have always refused to license anyone else but the OEM. The others have done it very, I would say, you know, they just look that if they get the money, they're fine. Every patent troll, every NPE will be willing to license the component manufacturer because they don't care who pays the money as long as they get the money. They are a lot less legal-minded than some of the bigger patent owners. Yeah,
that's very interesting, and that very much ties in also to the next question I would have. Now we've discussed, you know, what has been happening with 4G, but 5G is that really a game changer? Exactly because we have so many other applications. And I also, in this very same podcast here, had Luke McLeroy here that you know also very well from Avanci, and he promised or said that this year they're going to launch a 5G patent pool. You're expecting higher rates there?
Well, I mean, the rates will change, yes. There's no question about that. How much they will change is something that's everyone can take a guess, you know. My expectation would be that there will be different rates. That's point number one. If you have 5G as a straightforward continuation of 4G, so to speak, so no new technology being used, no new quality of service being developed, car manufacturers simply have to use 5G because 4G eventually will be phased out, and our cars have to work for 15 years, so we have to use 5G. The rates can't change much. I mean, they will go up lower 20s potentially or something like that. But that also there is an interesting question is, and that's for that number. Is it 20? Is it 15? Is it something in between? The question is, who are the patent owners that will join Avanci? If the big players are not participating, or some of the big players are not participating, then my expectation would be that the rates could even go down in the worst case. But why would I pay more than $50 to a pool like Avanci if companies like Nokia, Ericsson, Qualcomm, Interdigital, potentially LGE, Huawei, Samsung are not participating, and I know that I will have to pay to those companies as well. So if they basically only get the small fish, to put it that way, then the rates have to be lower. I would expect that they can get the big players as well again, most of the big players, but do they get all of them? I have my doubts that will happen. If it happens, then, as I said, the rates probably for a plain 4G successor should be close to 20, a little bit above, a little bit below. when it then comes to car-to-car communication without infrastructure, then there certainly are possibilities that the rates could go up further because there's more technology, more patents involved. And if we take that example that I used before, it has to be related or at least go in parallel with the technology use in the end product. Then an autonomous car would probably justify a somewhat higher rate. Again, is that 10% more? Is it $1 more or something like that? That's a guess. I don't give you an answer to that, but it could be more.
But thinking about rates of Avanci, let's say they don't get all the big fish, maybe that Avanci rate goes down, but I would guess overall the cumulative rate, if Avanci don't get all, will go up, right? Because typically a pool itself gathering most of the largest SEP owners rather reduces pricing, or?
Yeah, I guess there's no consensus in the industry, but the general feeling is that the stack royalty for 5G will be higher than the stack royalty for 4G. And my individual expectation would be that it's probably in the 20% range. It will go up.
Interesting. Yeah, very exciting to see how the 5G area will develop further. Now, talking about another topic, we said there's some friction right now. There is litigation right now, in particular in the auto industry. And one thing that has become in particularly complex is that most companies negotiate global FRAND rates, but courts are local. And we had the case of one UK court that determined a global FRAND rate. What is your opinion here? What should be, what should courts be able to determine?
Well, the question is, what can they determine? If you look at some of the more prominent cases, like the decision of Judge Selner in HTC against Ericsson, he basically decided on rates for 4G, 2G or 3G and 4G. And he had different rates for different global areas. So he said there is a US rate, there is a rate for Europe, so to speak, Europe and the rest of the world, and then there is a rate for China. And he gave different numbers for those rates. And that is something that's historically has been very prominent in many cases. I mean, not so much the difference between US and non-US. That was Selner's decision was on the number of patents that he deemed to be essential that were a part of the license. That hasn't happened so often, but a difference between China and rest of the world is a very common approach to justify a global agreement, even if we know that in some countries royalty rates are much lower. What the UK court did was that they created one global rate and said this global rate has to be taken. And if you're not willing to take that global rate, then we enjoin you from selling your products in the UK. And that's, that's an interesting question because it shows this problem that litigation is about individual patents in local jurisdictions. But FRAND licensing negotiations deal with global FRAND portfolio rates, portfolio licensing. So that's a huge difference, The patent owners want to get a global license agreement for their entire essential patent portfolio. And the size of that portfolio is unknown to everyone. But you cannot really say that company X has 120 essential patents, because next week one of those patents could be deemed not essential. It could be you could have a court decision that it becomes invalid. So those numbers change. You never know, and they may get new patents that become essential. But they don't. They want only one license agreement. While the implementers would like to take licenses only for some of the implementers at least want to take licenses only for individual patents in individual countries. And if the UK courts now say we can set a global rate. I believe they are a little bit stepping out of the bounds of their knowledge. And potentially we would need something like a WIPO arbitration board for global FRAND rates. How that works, I mean, I said I'm not a lawyer. Others should try to decide how they want to do that. But I believe it should be an international court or an international arbitration body. How that is organized remains open. Maybe for Europe, we could attach it to the European patent court or something like that. But on the other hand, that wouldn't help us because we still have this issue that Europe is not global.
Right. And I think that's an interesting argument. Also, the European Commission's SEP expert group, which you have been part of, have suggested or at least considered these licensing negotiation groups. One issue that I've been seeing, and some companies have been pushing for that very hard, is that, of course, this is something that has to be mutually agreed upon. So the plaintiff, as well the defendant, or if it hasn't been going to court yet, the SEP owner and the licensee have to agree to do that, right? And currently, some organizations, in particular, I feel the SEP owners are pushing for it, but many SEP licensees are shying away from it. And there's even one company tried to argue that someone who shies away from meeting in an arbitration court is an unwilling licensee. What is your opinion about this? How would that be successful? How can we create incentives maybe rather than penalties?
I guess you mentioned the right word. It's the question of incentives. If you look at these licensing negotiation groups, they've been in conference calls and webinars over and over again over the last few months. And the usual tenor of those presentations was, this is an antitrust problem, and it's just a new holdout mechanism that the the licensees, the implementers want to use to never pay royalties in the first place, and it's a buyer's cartel, which I think is a stupid issue because we're not buying the license, we're just taking a license. I think the issue really is that people usually are inherently negative to those proposals. They want to find an argument why they should not look into that. If you look at that from the positive side, you could say, what are the incentives of those groups that a patent owner should talk to them in the first place? Because they will only work if patent owners are willing to negotiate with those licensing negotiation groups. And you have to make it very clear that if you want to implement something like that, this is not a holdout mechanism. This is an effort to get an entire industry, let's say the entire smart meter industry, to agree on a value for a license for all standard essential patents that are needed at X. And if you can do that, you've got the chance to get license agreements with the entire industry and not with an individual player. Those are the incentives. And you have to make sure that it's not holdout, that a patent owner has to negotiate for 2 years with one of those licensing negotiation groups. And in the end, they, as we in Germany say, edge, we're not taking a license. You have to go back to the individual implementers. That cannot happen. Then it doesn't work. On the other hand, we've seen something similar to licensing negotiation groups with the syndicated deals of RPX, for example. So there is a possibility to do it. If you do it legally correct, it seems to work. And we simply should try whether it works or not, and not simply say, no, this is something new, and we never do something new, so we'll just stick to the old game. That is what I have seen in many of those webinars discussing this issue. But you had a second question that was not on LNGs. Can you repeat?
I think it was more about that litigation creates often friction, takes forever, and that maybe new models like that could work.
Yeah, right. The issue about whether someone who is not willing to go into arbitration should be an unwilling licensee. I think that's a very difficult issue because, I mean, arbitration, at least mandatory arbitration, a binding arbitration can only be done if both parties agree to go into arbitration. And to take away the decision the ability to decide by yourself as an implementer whether or not you are willing to go into binding arbitration is something that I would not try to do lightheartedly. On the other hand, if you do a non-binding arbitration, where basically in the end, if the parties agree to the result, then everyone's happy. If one of them does not agree, they still have to go back to court. But then the non-agreeing party basically has the burden of proof to show why the arbitration is wrong to a judge. That could be a possibility to at least streamline and reduce the number of litigations. But again, as I said, this is just the view of a negotiator and not a litigator, and certainly not the view of a lawyer. I think practically there could be a lot of positive effects if you do it right, and if the courts play the game. You know, the question really is if a judge is willing to say to the parties, please go and do an arbitration, and if you cannot agree to the outcome to the arbitration, come back and then I will decide.
Yeah, exciting to see. I think that could be a solution that, at least to me, makes sense. We would reduce costs on all ends and could also be fair, but we'll see how that could be designed. I just keep hearing that more and more, that these licensing negotiation groups are discussed and set up and also in some cases seem to work. Maybe to look a little bit more in the future, thinking not only about the auto industry, we've seen a lot of litigation, we have seen a lot of discussion, and that was the first vertical outside of the smartphone computer world. What, in your opinion, could be the next vertical? Would we also see litigation in other areas like manufacturing, smart energy, healthcare even? What are your thoughts there? Or are these industries fundamentally different?
You know, the question is, where do those technologies that create a lot of licensing income, and by creating a lot of licensing income also cause a lot of frictions in the licensing negotiation process, where do those technologies really become important? You know, I had many discussions with companies who build whiteware goods, refrigerators or kitchen devices or something like that. And to them, the answer, or the statement usually is, why should I need to use 4G and 5G if I can use Wi-Fi at a much lower royalty rate? So I'm happy to use 4G, especially if the house that where my device gets in has a good coverage, because 4G has advantages over Wi-Fi. But if it doesn't work price-wise and our customers are not paying, why should we do that? The same is true, for example, you know, there are some areas where Wi-Fi probably simply will not work. One of the important issues is traffic. Independently on whether it's cars or something else, roaming with Wi-Fi is difficult. On the other hand, as I said, on the other side, my fridge doesn't need roaming unless I build it into my mobile home. So let's look at the technologies first. Decide or try to find out, identify those application areas where the technology is used. And there we will have to look at the question, do the patent owners have the licensing power to really license the big players on the implementer side? Or all the players on the implementer side? I mean, that's an important issue, because FRAND licensing should not modify the market too much. So if you start licensing your standard essential patents, you better license all big players and later on all medium players, and not just one or two players and leave the rest alone. That can't happen either. So do they have the power to do that? Do the technology implementers have the know-how how to do that? How will that work? And my opinion or my expectation is that in many of those areas, it will be extremely difficult for the patent owners to really address everyone who needs their license. And it will be almost impossible for many of the application implementers and developers to understand from whom they have to take a license. And that is where pools and those licensing negotiation groups could have a very positive effect if you can implement them correctly.
So my understanding is probably beyond the auto industry, the licensees may have much more power in really selecting if a standard like 4 and 5G advances products, because there are alternatives. And that could also very much influence price points and attractiveness of implementing these connectivity standards.
You know, if you look at press releases, for example, InterDigital, for example, they always announce when they have new license agreements. All their license agreements dealing with cellular communications are that they publish or that they are proud of and put into their PR are with smartphone manufacturers. They do not have the manpower, they do not have the expertise, and they do not have the infrastructure to really license smart meter manufacturers or whiteware manufacturers and whatever. I mean, in the end, even every single traffic sign might have a 5G component. How many traffic sign manufacturers do we have in Germany alone? How could a company like InterDigital license their 5G portfolio to every individual manufacturer of traffic signs? It simply seems not feasible. You know, I mean, they have to find new ways how to organize this, if it's not being organized by the regulator, so to speak. But that's the last thing that I would hope to see in my lifetime, that this is become something like a mandatory license in a pool comparable to copyright fees, and everyone has to pay because there is a law that forces us to pay. I mean, I would hope that this will never happen. The industries should get together and they should try to find a way how to solve the issue.
Yeah. No, that is an interesting thought. And to summarize, we need some aggregation somewhere because anything else will be inefficient. Not because a company like InterDigital is incapable. It's just that the market is such a long tail that it's very difficult to negotiate the licenses with so many involved parties.
Yeah, I mean, let me say one more thing that is important. You know, the new players, the new implementers are very small, so the licensing income will be small from them. Even in the car industry, you know, we currently sell between 1.2 and 1.4 billion smartphones a year, but only between 80 and 90 million cars. So even if you could license all 90 million cars with your patent portfolio, you still only have leverage of less than 10% of the smartphone market. Right. And if you go from the car market to, as I said, smart meters, there are more smart meters in the end. I doubt it will be in the near future, but maybe. But those smart meters need less technology, so the license fees will be lower. So the net income of the patent owner will be even smaller in that industry, and that goes on and on. At some point in time, it simply will not, the administrative burden and the negotiation cost will no longer justify giving out licenses at all. If you look at 27 billion connected devices, and that's what Ericsson has told us we would have in 23. Maybe it's only in 26 or 27, but eventually we will get to those numbers.
Yeah. No, that's a good way. Matthias, it has been great. Very good thoughts here. Exciting discussion. My very last question to you. What do you want to leave our listeners keep remembering from you? What is your final pitch?
Well, you know, the final message that I would like to give our listeners is there's a lot of PR and a lot of news about fights in the SEP licensing area. it's by far not as bad as people say. It's not as bad as the patent owners want to make us believe it is. It is not as bad as the implementers want to make us believe it is. 90% of deals are done without litigation, without any press. They're simply negotiated and signed. And I wouldn't be too worried that this will really change and we will have a nuclear patent war in the 5G area in the near future. That's not going to happen. Just keep calm.
Sounds like a bright future. Great, Matthias. Thank you so much. Great thoughts and discussions here. I hope to see you soon. Thank you for being a guest on my SEP couch here, and all the best.
Thank you for having me there. It was fun. Thank you. Bye.